Sometimes, a single promise whispered across time can change everything. Tonight, we invite you to step into a story that will stir your soul, a story of scars, salvation, and the unbreakable bond between a broken man and a forgotten dog. What if saving one life could heal another? As Helen Keller once said, "Alone, we can do so little. Together, we can do so much." Stay with us, watch until the very end, and discover a lesson so profound, it might just change the way you see hope. Don't forget to subscribe. Your support helps us create more stories that matter. The wooden doors of the old auction house creaked under the weight of 100 restless bodies. The air was heavy with the scent of dust, damp leather, and the sharp, nervous energy of people looking for a bargain or a prize. Among the chatter and the shuffling feet stood an old man, almost invisible in the crowd, his figure hunched under a worn khaki jacket that had seen better days. Jackson, his hands, weathered and calloused by time and war, clutched something more fragile than he dared admit. A crumpled letter, its edges soft from being read too many times. He pressed it close to his heart, a silent vow echoing in the steady but tired beat of his chest. His gray eyes, dulled by years of loss, flicked upward toward the stage where today's main attraction paced in a steel pen. Valor. The pit bull was not the handsome, polished hero people imagined when they thought of a service dog. A jagged scar ran across his left eye, pulling the skin taut and giving him a permanent scowl. His body was lean, too lean, and his movements were stiff, betraying past injuries. Yet even behind that battered frame, there was a nobility, a stubborn fire that had not been extinguished. The auctioneer's gavel came down hard on the podium, snapping the room to attention. "Up next, folks, one retired K9 unit. Trained, strong, still has some good years left if you know how to handle him." The crowd stirred. Voices rose, sharp and eager. Men in heavy boots and baseball caps nudged each other, grinning wolfishly. They saw not a hero, but an opportunity. Dogfights, gambling, quick money. Jackson's stomach twisted at the thought. He unfolded the letter with trembling fingers, his eyes skimming the familiar, shaky handwriting. He could almost hear her voice. "If you ever find this dog, Dad, save him, like you saved me." Hannah's last letter, written from a hospital bed that had smelled of antiseptic and fading hope. Written with the last strength she had, after her body had betrayed her, but before her spirit had. She had met Valor during her stay, a therapy dog, scarred and gruff, yet gentle with those who needed him most. She loved him instantly. She believed he deserved more than a cold kennel or a cruel hand. And now, here he was, just as lost, just as forgotten as she had once been. Jackson tucked the letter back into his pocket as the bidding began. 200, someone barked from the left. 250, shouted another. Jackson hesitated. He had exactly $300 in his wallet, his emergency fund, the one he had promised himself he would never touch unless there was no other choice. Was this not that moment? He raised his hand, his voice barely cutting through the noise. 300! Heads turned. Laughter bubbled up from the crowd. "Old man wants himself a fighter," someone sneered. Jackson said nothing. His gaze locked on Valor's. For a fleeting second, the dog's tail gave a hesitant twitch, almost imperceptible. A signal, perhaps, or maybe just wishful thinking. Another bidder upped the ante. 350! Jackson's heart sank. He could not go higher. His emergency fund was gone with that last bid. He felt the weight of the letter against his chest like a brand. Hannah was here. In this moment. In this choice. The auctioneer's gavel hovered in the air, waiting, In a sudden, desperate impulse, Jackson yanked off the old wristwatch strapped to his arm. A simple, battered thing with a cracked face. A birthday gift from Hannah, given when she was just 10 years old. He shuffled forward through the crowd, offering it to the auctioneer, his voice steady but raw. "This too?" "It's worth something." There was a pause, a hush, as the auctioneer stared at him. The crowd murmured. Valor stood frozen, his body tense, ears pinned back. He watched Jackson, watched the exchange, as if understanding the stakes. Finally, the auctioneer shrugged. 300 with collateral. "Sold!" The gavel slammed down. The noise of the crowd faded into the background. Jackson barely noticed the jeers, the dismissive shakes of heads, the whispers of "crazy old fool." All he knew was that he had won. Or perhaps, simply, he had kept a promise. He approached the pen slowly. Valor's lips pulled back slightly, more uncertainty than threat. Jackson crouched low, ignoring the creaking of his knees, and extended a hand, palm up. "No one's gonna hurt you, son," he said quietly. "Not anymore." Valor sniffed the air, nostrils flaring. For a long, breathless moment, neither moved. Then, with a shuddering sigh, Valor lowered his head and pressed it against Jackson's hand. It was not trust, not yet. But it was a beginning. Jackson felt the sting of tears, unexpected and sharp. He blinked them back, patting the dog's scarred head gently. "You're coming home, soldier," he whispered. Around them, the crowd dispersed, their interest fading. They had missed it. The quiet miracle, the fragile thread knitting two broken souls together. As Jackson led Valor out of the auction house, the late afternoon sun slanted low across the gravel parking lot. Shadows stretched long, blending into one another. Somewhere deep inside him, where grief had carved a hollow canyon, Jackson felt a small, stubborn ember flicker to life. Hope. The air inside the auction house grew heavier, as if the walls themselves were closing in with tension. Jackson tightened his grip on the scrap of paper in his pocket, the words of his daughter burning into his heart with every beat. Around him, men shuffled and leaned forward, eager for blood, for money, for ownership. But for Jackson, it was about salvation, his and the dog's. The auctioneer's voice boomed through the dusty rafters. "Do I hear 350? A burly man near the front raised his hand. Preston. Everyone in the room seemed to recognize him, and a few exchanged nervous glances. Preston owned a dog-fighting operation outside of town, a place where Hope went to die. His reputation was as filthy as the grounds he kept. And worse, he had the money to outbid anyone who dared stand against him. Jackson's throat tightened. He knew Valor's fate if Preston won. 350 from the gentleman in the leather jacket, the auctioneer called. Jackson, with no more than a few crumpled bills in his wallet and a heart already worn thin, knew he had to do something. He stepped forward, his voice hoarse but determined. 400. A hush fell over the crowd. Some chuckled behind their hands. Others watched with morbid curiosity. An old man in a battered jacket challenging Preston. It was almost laughable. Preston smirked, lifting his hand casually. 500. Jackson's heart dropped. 500 was a mountain he could not climb. He patted his jacket, feeling for anything at all, that might give him a fighting chance. His fingers brushed the cracked face of his wristwatch, the last birthday gift from Hannah, a gift given with sparkling eyes and laughter, back when time still felt abundant. He unbuckled it slowly, the leather strap worn soft by years of wear. It felt like letting go of a part of his own soul. Jackson stepped up to the auctioneer, holding out the watch with trembling fingers. "I'll cover the difference with this," he said. The auctioneer hesitated, clearly unsure. But the room was hanging on the drama now, every eye pinned on the stage, every breath held. Finally, he nodded. 400 with collateral from the gentleman in the khaki jacket," he shouted. "Do I hear 550? Preston narrowed his eyes. For a moment, it seemed he would continue, crush Jackson like a bug under his boot. But something made him pause. Perhaps boredom. Perhaps the satisfaction of seeing an old man squirm. With a grunt, Preston shook his head and sat down heavily. The gavel slammed down. "Sold." The room erupted into a low buzz of murmurs and laughter. Some clapped mockingly. Others shook their heads. A few snickered openly. "Crazy old fool," someone muttered. "What's he gonna do with a broken mutt like that?" Another said under his breath. Jackson heard it all but cared for none of it. His legs wobbled as he approached the steel pen where Valor stood. The dog, battered and wary, stared back at him through the bars. For the first time in what must have been months, or maybe years, a glimmer of recognition sparked in Valor's deep brown eyes. Not recognition of Jackson himself, but recognition of something far more precious. Kindness. "Come on, soldier," Jackson murmured, unlatching the gate with fingers stiff from the cold and from fear. "You're coming home." He dropped to one knee, ignoring the ache in his bones, and reached out his hand, palm up, offering without demanding. Offering with nothing but the quiet sincerity that had once been enough to heal a broken girl lying in a hospital bed. Valor hesitated. The room seemed to hold its breath. Slowly, inch by inch, the pit bull shuffled forward, head low, scarred body trembling. His nose brushed Jackson's fingers once, twice, before he pressed the full weight of his head into the old man's palm. It was not a gesture of surrender. It was a gesture of trust. Jackson closed his eyes for a moment, overwhelmed by the flood of emotion threatening to break free. He rested his forehead gently against Valor's scarred head. "You're safe now," he whispered. "I swear it." The noise of the auction house fell away. The jeers, the mockery, the smell of old wood and stale smoke, it all dissolved into nothingness. There was only this moment, a scarred old man and a broken dog, finding each other in the wreckage of their lives. Jackson gently attached the leash handed to him by a tired attendant. Valor did not resist. Together, they walked toward the exit, the murmurs following them like ghosts. "Hope you like vet bills," someone shouted after them. "Should have just let him rot," another barked. Jackson did not turn around. Valor's steps were unsure at first. But with every stride alongside Jackson, something changed. His head lifted a fraction higher. His ears, once flat against his skull, perked slightly forward. The heavy, dragging gait became lighter, more certain. As they stepped out into the fading golden light of late afternoon, Jackson let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. He squinted up at the sky, painted in hues of amber and rose, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself a small smile. He looked down at Valor. The dog sat by his side, close enough that their shadows touched. "Welcome home, soldier," Jackson said softly. Valor's tail gave a cautious, almost shy wag. It wasn't just a rescue. It wasn't just an adoption. It was two lost souls, battered and bruised by life, daring to believe that maybe, just maybe, they still had something left to give. The evening sky outside the auction house had already dimmed into a smoky blue by the time Jackson and Valor made it to the battered old pickup truck. Jackson opened the door, and with surprising gentleness for a dog so scarred and weary, Valor climbed into the passenger seat and curled into a tight ball, as if making himself small would somehow shield him from the unknown. Jackson sat behind the wheel but made no move to start the engine. His hands rested heavily on the steering wheel, his gaze lost somewhere beyond the cracked windshield. The past, uninvited but inevitable, began to seep into the quiet cabin. Years ago, Jackson had been a different man. Stronger, maybe, or perhaps simply more hopeful. He had served proudly as a K-9 handler in the Army, working side by side with a German shepherd named Duke. Together they had saved lives, faced dangers most would never imagine. And when Jackson came home, it was with scars invisible to the eye, but carved deep into his soul. Yet for all the battles he had survived, he had been utterly unprepared for the one he faced at home. Hannah, his sweet, stubborn daughter, with a laugh like spring rain and eyes that had always been too wise for her age. She had been his world after her mother passed away, and for a time, it had seemed the two of them could weather anything together. Until the diagnosis. Jackson still remembered the sterile hospital room, the way the doctor's lips moved, but the words barely registered. Leukemia. Aggressive, late stage, Hannah had faced the news with a bravery that shamed him. While he staggered under the weight of fear and grief, she smiled through the pain, cracking jokes to make the nurses laugh, asking questions he could barely bring himself to answer. It was during those endless days at the treatment center that Hannah had met Valor. Jackson had been sitting slumped in a plastic chair, half asleep and all but defeated, when he heard a sudden commotion. A therapy dog event had been scheduled for the pediatric wing, and amid the soft barks and excited giggles, one dog had slipped his handler's leash. A young pit bull, his coat patchy and one ear bent awkwardly, had bounded into Hannah's room like a storm. Jackson had jolted upright, ready to chase the dog out. But then he saw Hannah. She had been mid-panic attack, something that had happened more often as the treatments wore on her fragile body. Her chest had been heaving, her face pale and slick with sweat. And then Valor had been there. The pit bull had pressed his broad head into her lap, grounding her with a weight and warmth so steady it had broken through the fear choking her. His tail thumped softly against the floor, slow and sure, a heartbeat she could anchor herself to. Hannah had calmed. It was the first time in weeks Jackson had seen his daughter smile without effort, without grimace. The dog's handler had apologized profusely, embarrassed and flustered. But Hannah had clung to Valor's neck, whispering something into his ragged ear. Jackson had seen the way Valor leaned into her, as if understanding her in a way no human could. After that day, whenever the therapy dogs came, Hannah asked for Valor. But life, as it often did, had been cruelly short on mercy. Valor's handler transferred to another post, and the dog, deemed too unruly for therapy certification, was retired from the program. No one knew where he had ended up. Hannah's condition worsened. Jackson had sat by her bedside, feeling helpless, feeling useless, as the days slipped through his fingers like grains of sand. One evening, when the machines hummed a little too loudly and Hannah's breathing was a little too shallow, she had handed him a letter. The paper was crinkled and smudged with the faint scent of her lavender lotion. "If you ever find this dog, Dad," the letter began, "save him." "Like you saved me." Jackson had pressed the letter to his heart, promising silently, desperately, that he would. But he never found Valor. Not in time. Hannah passed away 2 weeks later, just shy of her 16th birthday. The house had become a mausoleum. Her laughter was trapped in the walls, her scent lingering in the folds of the curtains, her absence a weight that pressed down harder than any battlefield injury Jackson had ever suffered. He had carried the guilt like a second skin. Why hadn't he tried harder to find the dog? Why hadn't he been able to save her? The years blurred together after that, a haze of mechanical days and sleepless nights. Jackson withdrew from friends, from life, from everything that did not bear Hannah's imprint. Until today. Until a battered pit bull with scars on his body and a flickering spark in his eyes had looked at him across a cold steel cage. Until a battered old man with nothing left to lose had gambled everything on a promise made in a dying girl's whisper. Jackson reached into his pocket and pulled out the letter once more. The creases were deep now. The ink faded in spots from the countless times he had read it. He unfolded it carefully, smoothing it against the steering wheel. His fingers traced the familiar words. "If you ever find this dog, Dad, save him." He turned his head to Valor, who was watching him now with cautious, steady eyes. Not fearful, not distrustful. Watching like a soldier awaiting orders. Jackson's throat tightened. "You saved her," he said aloud, his voice cracking. "It's my turn to save you." Outside, the night deepened. Stars began to prick the sky, silent and patient. Inside the truck, two broken hearts began, slowly, to stitch themselves back together. The first days back home were anything but easy. Valor, the scarred pit bull that Jackson had fought so desperately for, was a broken soul wrapped in muscle and fear. He was a storm bottled up inside a battered body, quick to flinch, quicker to snarl. Every sudden noise sent him into a trembling panic. Every unfamiliar face turned him into a defensive fighter. Valor wasn't just mistrustful. He was haunted by memories that Jackson could only guess at. At night, Valor paced endlessly, circling the small living room like a restless ghost. His claws clicked against the worn wooden floor as he struggled to find peace that refused to come. Sometimes he would bark sharply into the dark, as if fighting off shadows only he could see. Jackson sat quietly by the cold fireplace, watching him, understanding the kind of pain that didn't let you sleep. Jackson, too, carried scars, some stitched across his skin, others burned into his heart. Decades of service as a canine handler had taught him the sharpness of loss, the loneliness of survival. The worst scar, though, wasn't from war. It was the empty chair at the dining table, the silence of a house that once echoed with Hannah's laughter. Now, that silence screamed. He didn't expect Valor to trust him overnight. Jackson understood broken things. You had to give them space, patience, and the kind of loyalty that didn't ask for anything back. And so he gave it, every day, in 1,000 small ways. He left the front door open just a crack wider, so Valor wouldn't feel trapped. He placed bowls of food and water within sight, but not within reach, inviting rather than forcing. He never raised his voice, never made sudden movements. He spoke in low tones, telling stories that weren't meant to be answered, stories about Hannah, about the little things he missed. Her singing while doing homework, the way she would sneak extra treats to stray dogs, her stubborn belief that even the most broken things deserved to be loved. One night, a heavy rain came, cold and relentless. Jackson found Valor curled up on the porch, shivering violently, too frightened to step into the house, too proud to cry. The old man stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of helplessness pressed down on his chest. Without a word, Jackson took off his tattered khaki coat, the same coat he had worn to the auction, and laid it gently over Valor's trembling body. Then he sat down beside him, right there on the soaked wood, ignoring the rain that seeped through his clothes. He leaned back against the doorframe, pulled the coat edges tighter around the dog and closed his eyes. If Valor couldn't come inside, Jackson would meet him where he was. Hours passed. The storm raged on. Somewhere around midnight, Valor shifted. Slowly, carefully, He inched closer to Jackson. A wet nose nudged against the old man's wrist. Then a heavy head rested awkwardly on Jackson's lap. For a long while, neither of them moved. It was a beginning. The days that followed were built on these fragile moments. Jackson celebrated every tiny victory, the way Valor's tail gave a small, uncertain wag when he came home from town, the hesitant lick on Jackson's calloused hand when food was offered, the quiet sigh as Valor fell asleep near Jackson's chair, no longer keeping one eye open in fear. There were setbacks, of course. A fallen broomstick sent Valor into a wild panic one afternoon, tearing through the house and knocking over a lamp. Jackson didn't scold him. Instead, he sat down in the wreckage and waited until Valor, breathing heavily and trembling, dared to creep back toward him. Each stumble was met with patience, never punishment. One afternoon, sitting by the cracked fireplace, Jackson spoke to Valor, as he always did. "You know, boy," he said, his voice thick, "she would have loved you. She saw something good in you, just like she saw it in me." Valor lifted his scarred head and looked at him. There was something different in his eyes that day. Not just fear, but something deeper. Recognition. Maybe even a sliver of trust. These were not grand, cinematic moments. They were quiet and messy and slow. But in each tentative touch, each shared silence, two wounded souls were stitching themselves back together. It wasn't just about healing Valor. Jackson was finding pieces of himself, too. In caring for a creature who had been thrown away by the world, he was keeping his promise to Hannah. And maybe, just maybe, finding a way to keep breathing in a world that had seemed too empty to bear. Some nights Jackson still sat on the porch long after the stars came out, Valor's head heavy against his knee. He would look up at the endless sky and whisper into the cool darkness. "I'm trying, baby girl," he said. "I'm trying." And Valor, once a creature of pure survival, stayed. Not because he had to, but because he chose to. In his quiet way, Valor answered back. "You're not alone anymore." Ben first appeared in their lives on a dusty afternoon when the world seemed weighed down by late summer heat. Jackson was working on repairing a broken fence post when he noticed a skinny boy with a mop of uncombed hair hovering just beyond the property line. The boy wore a tattered baseball cap, sneakers worn to threads, and a backpack that looked twice his size. His eyes, though, those big, earnest eyes, were what caught Jackson's attention. "Hey, mister," the boy called out, a little hesitant, a little bold. "That's your dog." Jackson wiped the sweat from his brow and nodded, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Valor, lying in the shade nearby, instantly stiffened. A low, warning growl rumbled from his throat. Ben took a step back, hands raised in a peace offering. "It's okay, boy. I don't want to hurt you," he said softly, almost whispering. There was no fear in his voice, only a deep, raw empathy, the kind of understanding that came from his own bruised heart. Jackson noticed the way Ben moved, slow and deliberate, respecting Valor's space. Most people would have turned away at the first growl, but not this kid. Later, Jackson learned more about the boy. Ben lived 2 houses down, in a weathered trailer that barely stood upright. His mother had passed away the previous winter after a long illness, and now he lived with his grandmother, a frail woman whose strength was ebbing away like the tide. At only 12 years old, Ben had learned more about loss and loneliness than most grown men. In the beginning, Valor wanted nothing to do with him. The pit bull's instincts screamed defense at the sight of a stranger, even one so small and gentle. Every time Ben approached, Valor would retreat, ears pinned back, body rigid with mistrust. Jackson, remembering his own slow journey with Valor, didn't intervene. He let the boy try. And Ben, bless his stubborn heart, did. He came by every afternoon, sitting a few feet away from the porch where Valor liked to sprawl. He brought small offerings, pieces of jerky, a battered tennis ball, once even a hand-drawn picture of a dog with a crooked smile. He talked to Valor in a low, patient voice, telling him about school, about his grandma's garden, about how he wished he had a dog of his own. Little by little, Valor's suspicions started to crack. First, it was a shift in posture, a little less rigid, a little more curious. Then, it was the way his nose would twitch toward the scent of jerky, even though his body stayed planted firmly away. Finally, one miraculous day, as Ben rolled the tennis ball gently across the porch floor, Valor lifted a cautious paw and stopped it. Ben didn't cheer or rush in. He simply smiled, a quiet, knowing smile, and kept talking as if it were the most natural thing in the world. That was the turning point. Jackson watched it all unfold from his chair by the window, heart aching in a way he hadn't felt since Hannah was alive. There was something about Ben, the way he knelt down low to be less threatening, the way he waited for Valor to make the first move, the way he lit up with pure joy at the smallest signs of trust, that stirred memories Jackson had buried deep. In Ben's gentle persistence, in his easy laughter and quiet resilience, Jackson saw a flicker of Hannah. It hit him like a punch to the gut some days, the resemblance not in looks, but in spirit. That unbreakable belief in second chances, that wide-open heart that refused to give up, even when the world seemed cruel. Valor, too, seemed to sense it. He began to look for Ben around the time school let out, ears perking up at the sound of sneakers scuffing the gravel driveway. He tolerated Ben's presence first, then welcomed it, inching closer each day until one afternoon he placed his heavy head in Ben's lap and let out a sigh so deep it seemed to empty all the fear from his bones. From then on, they were inseparable. Jackson, cautious at first, found himself teaching Ben the basics of dog handling. Not the cold commands of military training, but the softer, trust-building work that had saved Valor's soul. He showed Ben how to use hand signals, how to read a dog's body language, how to let patience speak louder than orders. Ben soaked it all up like a thirsty sponge, his excitement infectious. Together, they worked with Valor every afternoon, turning training into a game, into a partnership. There were setbacks, of course. Old fears don't vanish overnight. But there was laughter, too. So much laughter that sometimes it filled the house to bursting, pushing out the heavy ghosts of grief that had lived there too long. Watching them, Jackson felt something he thought he had lost forever. Hope. There were moments when he caught himself imagining what it would have been like if Hannah had lived, if she had known this boy, this dog, this new beginning. It hurt. It always would. But it also healed. Like knitting broken bones back together, painful but necessary. In quiet moments, Jackson realized that he was being given another chance, not to replace what he had lost, but to honor it. Through Valor, through Ben, he could be something he hadn't dared hope for in a long time. He could be a father again. One evening, after a particularly good training session where Valor flawlessly followed Ben's lead through a series of hand signals, Jackson found himself standing on the porch, looking at the boy and the dog wrestling playfully in the yard. Ben's laughter floated up into the warm twilight, and Jackson felt the tightness in his chest loosen just a little more. He murmured to himself, voice hoarse but sure, "You're doing good, kid. You're doing real good." And somewhere in the golden light of the setting sun, it almost felt like Hannah was smiling too. It was a crisp autumn evening when the nightmare began. Preston, the cruel man from the auction, hadn't forgotten about Valor. Word had gotten around town that Jackson's once worthless pit bull was thriving, training, bonding, even becoming a symbol of hope for some folks who had seen too much heartbreak. Rumors swirled, whispers that maybe, just maybe, Jackson was preparing to expose the darker corners of Preston's world. His dogfighting rings, the bruised animals hidden behind his shining facade. Preston couldn't allow that. One night, as a chilly wind rattled the windows of Jackson's small home, danger crept in like a poison. Under the cover of darkness, Preston sent 2 men to finish what he could not. They broke in through the back door, their boots muddy, their faces hidden under hoods. Valor barked ferociously, placing himself between the intruders and the bedroom where Jackson slept. But 2 against 1, and with brutal efficiency, they overpowered the dog. Jackson, hearing the commotion, rushed out, barefoot, unarmed, heart pounding. He fought with everything he had left in him, fists swinging wildly, refusing to let them take Valor. But he was no longer the soldier he once was. Age, sorrow, and the heavy burden of grief had slowed him down. A hard blow to the back of his head sent him crashing to the floor. The last thing Jackson saw before the darkness swallowed him was Valor being dragged away, his legs kicking helplessly against the ground. Morning came, and the town woke to terrible news. Jackson was found unconscious by a neighbor who heard the commotion and called for help. The police came, the ambulance followed, but Valor was gone. The hospital's fluorescent lights hummed as Jackson lay still, battered and broken, in a sterile bed. Ben stood by his side, clutching Jackson's weathered hand, his own knuckles white with rage and fear. Tears brimmed in the boy's eyes, but did not fall. Ben had learned early that sometimes you had to be your own hero. While the adults whispered in worried clusters, shaking their heads and murmuring about how cruel the world could be, Ben was already forming a plan. Valor was out there, somewhere. And Ben would find him. He rallied his friends, the ragtag crew of neighborhood kids who had grown up tough and resourceful. There was Ellie, sharp-eyed and quick on her feet. Travis, whose older brother taught him how to track deer in the woods. And little Sam, no bigger than a backpack, but fierce enough to fight a bear if he had to. They pieced together what they knew. Preston had a property out past the edge of town, a place rumored to be more kennel than home, a place no one wanted to talk about. The journey there was dangerous, the night thick with fog and fear. But Ben's resolve was iron. With flashlights tucked into their belts and an old hand-drawn map scrawled on the back of a grocery bag, they set out. As they approached Preston's hidden compound, the smell hit them first. Blood, sweat, fear. The sound of dogs barking, snarling, fighting for survival filled the cold night air. Ben's stomach twisted. He recognized Valor's bark, a desperate, painful sound. Among the chaos, they crept closer, slipping through a gap in the fence, heartbeats hammering in their ears, and what they saw froze them to the bone. Valor was in a crude fighting pit, battered and bleeding, forced to fight larger, meaner dogs, while men jeered and shouted from the shadows. His spirit wasn't broken yet. No, not Valor, but his strength was ebbing fast. Before Ben could call out, a hand clamped down on his shoulder. They had been spotted. Rough hands grabbed the kids, dragging them into the light. Preston's thugs laughed cruelly, mocking the little heroes. One of them shoved Ben to the ground, sneering as the boy struggled to rise. That's when Valor saw them. Despite the blood in his eyes, despite the pain racking his body, Valor surged forward with a roar that shook the earth. He slammed into the nearest attacker, teeth flashing, muscles straining. He didn't hesitate, didn't falter. Protecting these children, his family now, was more important than his own battered body. The chaos gave Ben the opening he needed. He grabbed a broken stick and swung it at one of the thugs, yelling for Ellie and Sam to run. Travis wrestled free and bolted for the gate, shouting into a cell phone he had managed to smuggle in his sock. "Help! Preston's place. They've got dogs. Kids, send the police." The next moments blurred together in a whirlwind of barking, shouting, flashing lights, sirens, the pounding of boots. Yells of, "Police! Hands in the air!" Squad cars flooded the clearing, red and blue lights slicing through the darkness. Officers stormed the compound, rounding up Preston's men, cutting the locks off the cages where trembling, wounded dogs lay trapped. In the chaos, Ben clung to Valor, whispering encouragement, tears streaming down his face at last. Valor, weak but still breathing, licked the boy's hand once, a silent vow that he wasn't giving up yet. Later, as Jackson was wheeled into the animal clinic on a gurney beside Valor, his battered hand found Ben's small one. "You did good, kid," Jackson whispered hoarsely. Ben squeezed back, his voice shaking but proud. "We're family now." "We don't leave family behind." As they wheeled Valor into surgery, Jackson closed his eyes, breathing a prayer into the still night air. Not just for the dog, not just for the boy, but for all of them. For second chances. For hope, stubborn and shining, even in the darkest places. The months that followed were not easy, but they were filled with something Jackson hadn't felt in years. Purpose. His body healed slowly, each bruise and fracture taking its time to fade. But the deeper wounds, the ones stitched across his heart, were the ones he feared might never close. Yet somehow, each day brought a little more light. Valor, too, bore his scars, both visible and invisible, but he refused to let them define him. With Jackson's steady hand on his side and Ben's infectious laughter always nearby, Valor began to flourish. His trust, once shattered, was rebuilt brick by brick, moment by tender moment. They became something of a legend in the town. A battered old soldier, a dog who had survived hell, and a boy who refused to give up on either of them. But Jackson knew their story couldn't end there. One morning, standing under a clear blue sky, Jackson made a decision. They would not let their pain simply fade into private memory. They would turn it into something bigger, something lasting. Jackson partnered with a few other veterans and animal lovers in town, people who understood the deep bond between a soldier and a dog. Together, they transformed an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town into something extraordinary, a rehabilitation and adoption center for retired military and service dogs. The walls were scrubbed clean, the floors polished until they shone. Bright kennels with soft beds lined the halls, not cold cages. Outside, a wide training yard offered a place for healing, for dogs and humans alike. At the front of it all stood Jackson, Valor at his side. And Ben, officially named the youngest apprentice trainer the center had ever seen, with a badge he wore proudly over his heart. Training sessions became moments of laughter and tears, of setbacks and breakthroughs. Valor, once feared and discarded, became a gentle giant among the newcomers, helping traumatized dogs learn to trust again. Jackson and Ben worked side by side, patience woven into every word they spoke, every touch they gave. Every once in a while, Jackson would catch a glimpse of Hannah's spirit in the way Ben encouraged a frightened dog to take its first step toward trust. In the way Valor lay quietly beside a trembling pup, offering silent comfort. In the way hope refused to be extinguished, no matter how dark the starting place had been. The center quickly earned a reputation far beyond their small town. Soldiers from across the state brought their retired canine partners, seeking a place where healing wasn't just promised, it was lived every single day. On the one-year anniversary of Valor's rescue, the center hosted a small ceremony. Sunlight poured in through the tall windows as Jackson stood before a modest crowd of friends, veterans, townsfolk, and children clutching worn leashes attached to newly hopeful dogs. At the front of the room, covered by a soft white cloth, hung something new. Ben, cheeks flushed with pride, stepped forward and pulled the cloth away. There, gleaming in the gentle light, was a framed photograph, a snapshot of pure love and defiance against despair. It showed a younger Hannah, her arms wrapped tight around Valor's broad neck, her smile wide and brilliant against the fading evening light. Valor, even then, wore an expression not of fierceness, but of fierce loyalty. Beneath the photograph, in elegant lettering, read the words, "In loving memory of Hannah Valor, Defenders of Hope." Silence filled the room, thick and reverent. Jackson stared up at the photograph, his vision blurring. His hands, once so steady in battle, trembled at his sides. But he welcomed the tears. They were not tears of regret anymore. They were tears of gratitude, for a daughter who had taught him what it meant to love without reservation, for a dog who had taught him that brokenness was not an ending, but a beginning, for a boy who reminded him that hope was not just for the young, it was for anyone brave enough to believe in it again. Jackson felt a hand slip into his. Ben stood there, grinning awkwardly, his other hand resting lightly on Valor's massive head. "We did good, huh, Mr. Jackson?" Ben whispered. Jackson laughed, rough and soft at the same time. He squeezed the boy's hand, feeling the strong pulse of life and promise there. "Yeah, kid," he said, his voice thick. "We did real good." Outside, life went on, the breeze rustling the trees, the distant bark of a dog eager for his next chance. Inside, the walls of the center seemed to breathe, with all the stories yet to come, all the lives yet to be saved. Valor lifted his head, his amber eyes glinting in the afternoon light, and let out a low, rumbling bark, not of warning, but of triumph. The battle scars they carried were real, but they no longer defined them. They were not survivors anymore. They were family. They were home. And somewhere, in the quiet spaces between breaths, Jackson could almost hear Hannah's voice again, laughing, whispering with pride. "You saved him, Dad, just like you saved me." Only this time Jackson smiled through the tears and whispered back into the sunlight, "No, sweetheart, you saved all of us." And so, from the ashes of grief, a legacy of hope was born. Jackson, Valor, and little Ben showed us that even the deepest wounds can become the roots of something beautiful. What lies behind us and what lies before us are tiny matters compared to what lies within us, wrote Ralph Waldo Emerson. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, and subscribe. It is your encouragement that fuels our passion to bring more meaningful, heartfelt stories to life. Remember, every scar has a story, and every story can light a path for someone lost in the dark. Thank you for being part of this journey. Until we meet again, stay kind, stay strong, and never stop believing in second chances.